the link.
Okay.
Hello, Aspen team. Okay, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this in-service. We are going to be learning from Debbie Booth today. She is with Adult Protective Services. And then today our topic is the abuse, neglect, and exploitation of vulnerable adults. And this, as many of you know, this is something that we learn on every year. It's very important to be aware of this with our clients, just so you can keep an eye out and be, just careful and aware, and keep an eye on all of our clients and make sure that they're in the healthiest state that they can be. So I will just pass over to Debbie and let her teach you.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Let me get this screen shared. So again, as Melissa said, today we're going to be talking about abuse, neglect, and exploitation of vulnerable adults. Many of you have had this training in the past. However, I don't think we've ever gone into it with a PowerPoint. So this might be a little different, and it's probably a little bit more information than you're used to having. So you might think about, again, it's really important to stay through the training so you can see exactly what's happening in the world. This is a map of the world, and the areas in blue show the areas where the population over the age of 60 is above 20%. So that's a huge, huge amount of our world. And again, you folks know that because you're serving this most vulnerable population. By the year 2030, which used to be a long way off, but now it's only 9 years away, 1 in 5 people will be over the age of 65. So again, this is really significant information and really important for us to know in the aging field. Some statistics: for the first time in history, people over the age of 65 will outnumber children under the age of 5. And I think that that's really significant because we know that we have a lot of young children, but oftentimes we don't pay attention to our aging adults. So this is one statistic I think people will need to start listening to. Worldwide, about 50 million people have dementia. So every year there are 10 million new cases. You probably have seen these in terms of caring for your folks. And this is an area where we're going to have more and more and more issues in the future. So it might be something that those of you who want to get involved may use this as a platform to talk to your legislators or your community leaders about dementia. We'll go into that a little bit later. This is one thing that I think is really striking. Elders who have been abused have a 300% higher risk of death when compared to those who have not been mistreated. So again, when you think about all of the people in your world, and I want you to think about this training, not just with your job and your responsibilities as far as Aspen are concerned, but I want you to think about this more globally. So I want you to think about this maybe with your parents or your grandparents. I want you to think about your church groups, your community, your neighborhood, all the people that you know, and apply these facts to them, because I think it's really important that we understand that we really need to protect this aging population. I want to talk a little bit about ageism. So ageism tends to be discrimination based on negative assumptions about age. So a lot of times people will have preconceived notions. Say, let's say, for example, we have somebody that's in their 80s. We talk about a female that's in their 80s. We oftentimes have sort of a notion about what that person looks like, what that person can do, what that person can't do. And I need to tell you that we need to put aside those notions, because this population is really diverse. And so we may have people that are in their early 60s that have really serious medical concerns, but we also might have people that are really viable and they're really active and that sort of thing. A lot of times we think that the people that are in this vulnerable population are unworthy of our attention. And as you know, as we all know, that isn't true. So again, I want you to just think about these ageism issues. Um, Make sure that you don't treat these vulnerable adults as children. Don't talk to them like they're children. Talk to them like they're adults. Don't assume that they don't have the ability to recall events, because they do. And don't assume that they can't hear or that they can't see. Treat them with dignity and respect. That's probably the most important thing you need to do, is treat them with dignity and respect. So what is Adult Protective Services? We're a state agency with the responsibility and authority to investigate abuse, neglect, and exploitation involving vulnerable adults. And there are two statutes that govern what we do, in our work. The first is the civil statute. The second is the criminal statute. And many of the things that we're going to talk about today can be criminal in nature. So it's important that we understand that there are both sides of that. So we need to decide who is a vulnerable adult. The first definition of a vulnerable adult is anybody over the age of 65. So it doesn't matter if I can run a marathon, it doesn't matter what I can do physically or what my mental capacity is. If I'm over the age of 65, then I fit in this very vulnerable adult category. The second category is anybody over the age of 18 who has a mental or physical impairment that substantially affects their ability to care for themselves. So, for example, if we have a woman that is, say, she's 47, but she actually has the mental capacity of a 6-year-old, she definitely would be considered vulnerable because she can't care for herself. Even though she's not in the 65 range, she's over the age of 18 and she can't provide these things such as personal protection, obtain services for health and safety. And she doesn't know the consequences of remaining in that situation. So that's really, really important for you to know. So this is what we do to respond to reports. We're going to investigate reports of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. And Adult Protective Services investigators are going to go out and conduct an assessment of that vulnerable adult situation. And they're going to conduct interviews, much as law enforcement does, in terms of having interviews with victims, perpetrators, any witnesses, so that they can get to the bottom of the story. We certainly don't want to assume that something is going on when it isn't. So we're going to go out and actually interview people so that we get the straight scoop. We're going to perform capacity and needs assessments. So a capacity assessment in our world basically tells us what that person, if they're able to know the consequences of their actions. So it would be mental capacity. And us determining the capacity is important because it's really different to assume that someone has the mental capacity when they don't, and we treat them very differently, such as someone that has dementia. We're going to always assume decision-making capacity unless proven otherwise. So that means when we go into the home, we're going to assume that that person knows the consequences of their actions, unless we, during the interview with that person or others, we find that that is not the case. And probably the most that we do is coordinate with and refer to community resources. So we're going to refer to people in the community that can help that vulnerable adult. And we try to provide the least restrictive in nature and community based, so that that person can always feel comfortable and stay in their community if possible. This is important because it's important for you to know what we can't do. Oftentimes people compare us to Child Protective Services, and we know that Child Protective Services, if somebody is in an unsafe situation, Child Protective Services can remove that child. Well, Adult Protective Services, we do not have that legal authority. We cannot take custody of an adult. So we assume that adults have the right to self-determination unless there is danger of injury and death. So again, when we go into a situation, we're going to assume that that person is able to make decisions unless otherwise proven. We can't put them in a nursing home or other facility, even though it may be a more protected environment. We don't have the legal authority to do that. And it's also important to know that family members don't have that legal authority either. So sometimes family members will threaten and they'll say to their loved one, if you don't do, blah, 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 I'm going to put you in a nursing home. Just understand that they don't have the legal authority to do that. And we can't provide any service without the voluntary consent of the alleged victim or their guardian. So that's important to know as well. This is the most important thing you need to know, and it's very, very important to your job. So in Utah, we have a mandatory reporting law, and that law says any person who has reason to believe that a vulnerable adult has been the victim of abuse, neglect, or exploitation must report. Very important, must report. So that means that you have the legal responsibility to report to Adult Protective Services and or law enforcement. It means that you don't have to make a decision if it's bad enough or if it's abuse, neglect, or exploitation. But on the other hand, you don't get to make that choice either. You must report. And understand that all reports are confidential. So no one's going to know that it's you making that report. And I think that's really important so that you can know that the people that you're protecting may not have a reason to know that you're the person that made that report. Okay, so we're going to get into it. And I have some pictures that are sometimes hard to look at. You have not seen these in the past, but I want to show these to you because I think it's important to see examples of what we're talking to. The picture on the upper left-hand corner is a picture of a man. You can see his jawbone. You can see he's got bruises. This man was walking down the street with a female companion. She asked him for money and he declined. So she beat him up. This is an example of where domestic violence is not the usual. We oftentimes think that it's always perpetrated by the male because they're stronger and bigger. But this is a case where it was the female that was the perpetrator. And we need to think about these situations because in cases of some types of dementia, for example, Lewy body, the person tends to be more aggressive or sometimes violent. So we need to think about times when it isn't the male perpetrator, it could be the female. So this is domestic violence. Picture on the right is a picture of a young lady, and she's in a group home. She was diminished capacity, so that means that her age, which was much different than her chronological age. So she might have been in her 30s, 40s, whatever, but her age was much lower in terms of her capacity. So the victim said staff tell her she's crazy, that she's going to burn in hell, that she deserves to rot in jail, and that when her mother finds out how she acts, her mother will hate her. And, with many of us, we would just ignore this kind of information. We would say, that person doesn't know what they're talking about. They're just exaggerating. But when you're dealing with people that have diminished capacity, they're going to internalize all this information. So when you say things to them, you may be just kidding, but they don't know that. So we need to be really, really careful about the things we say to people with diminished capacity because they don't have the cognitive ability to determine when we're kidding and when we're not. Picture on the bottom left-hand corner is a picture of a woman who had advanced stage Alzheimer's, and she was taken care of by her husband. And he was a great caregiver for a really long time. but he just hit that brick wall. And many of you have probably seen that with caregivers. They just hit that brick wall. What happened is he would kind of shake her because she would ask those same questions every day, 842 times. And he would get frustrated. He would shake her. He would sort of pat her on the side of the face. And even though we can sort of understand the frustration, it's never okay to abuse someone. So we would use this opportunity to provide education for this man. Maybe we would refer him to you folks, or we would maybe try to find some resources like maybe some respite or other resources within the community. But again, this is never okay, even though it seems like he was taking care of her very well for a long time. Again, it's not okay to abuse. Picture on the right-hand corner is a picture of a young woman who was also in a group home. She also had diminished capacity, and she got into a power struggle with the person that was taking care of her, the certified nursing assistant. And if any of you have ever been in those power struggles with your children, it's not pretty. It's one of those situations that you wish you'd never gotten into, but we sort of get pulled in. So the CNA told this woman to go to her room. And as a child, as with the capacity of a child, she said no. And they get into this back and forth argument. And finally, the CNA gets frustrated. She takes her by her ankles and she drags her to her room. Again, it's never okay to abuse someone, particularly with this sort of thing. And the CNA was terminated and won't work in this healthcare field again. So it's really, really important that you know that you need to keep those emotions under check and that it's not okay to abuse someone. This is a picture of a woman who was in her mid-60s. This woman had to actually crawl to her neighbor's house to get away from her perpetrator. You can see that she's got bite marks by her ear, on her chin. She's got contusions, abrasions. She's got ligature marks on her throat where her perpetrator tried to strangle her. And her perpetrator was her grandson. Grandson wanted to borrow grandma's car. She didn't want to let him because he was either on drugs or inebriated. And so he did this to her. So this was a good case for us, not because grandma was abused, but because we had many witnesses to this. Many times you will see situations where the victim will refuse to acknowledge that they were abused in some way, mainly because either it's a relative or a close person, they don't want to get in trouble, and so they'll refuse to acknowledge it. In this case, again, we had witnesses. Young man goes to jail, grandma goes to the hospital, and young man is calling grandma the next day from jail, and he's saying, "Grandma, please get me out of here. Grandma, I love you. Grandma, I'll never do this again. Grandma, please, this isn't a good place." Believe it or not, even though he had done this to her, grandma wanted to get him out of jail. But again, as I said, this was a good case because we had witnesses and we were able to corroborate with those witnesses what had actually happened, exclusive of grandma's testimony. So young man was sentenced and spent some time in jail. But again, it's really difficult for the vulnerable adults because oftentimes these people are their grandchildren or their children or someone close to them. But even though we acknowledge that, it's not okay to abuse. So again, we talked about several types of abuse, the first being physical abuse. The second, when we talked about the young woman who had things said to her by the staff, it was emotional and verbal abuse. And then we talk about sexual abuse. Sexual abuse can entail, if you're helping someone with toileting or showering or things like that, be very, very careful in terms of how you help them in those situations. Make sure that you're not rough. Make sure that you're very gentle and careful with them. We had a situation where a CNA was angry at one of the residents in an assisted living, and she purposely was rough when she helped the woman with her toileting. So again, I think that it's really important for us to think about those things. Um, with abuse cases, they can be charged criminally in a court of law. So I think it's important for us to acknowledge that they can be criminal cases. The next thing we're going to talk about is neglect, specifically here, caretaker neglect. A picture on the left is a picture of a young man who had diminished capacity, and his family said they were taking care of him. I don't think so much. They weren't taking care of him. He looks malnourished, he looks dehydrated, and the family was taking care of this, or said they were taking care of this young man, and didn't want him to leave their family situation, mainly because they got money for him. So every month he received a check, and if he went somewhere else to live, they wouldn't get that money. Well, I'm pleased to say that someone made a report of this young man, and along with law enforcement, the case went to court, and another guardian was picked to be the guardian and take care of this young man. And so I'm pleased to say that he's doing well and really is flourishing in this situation. So this is a case of caretaker neglect. Also with bed sores, decubitus ulcers, you may be dealing with someone who is perhaps bedbound or in a wheelchair. Make sure that you help them reposition themselves while you're at their place, because again, a bed sore comes from that area having pressure and non-movement. And so that area essentially has pressure and dies. You can see a picture of this woman who had a stage 4 decubitus ulcer. And as a result of that, it becomes septic through the bacteria that can enter into those wounds, and oftentimes those people die. So again, it's really important that we take care of the folks that are bedbound or maybe in a wheelchair. This is a picture of a man who had Alzheimer's. His family went to go somewhere and for whatever reason didn't take him with them. He was locked in this shed in the backyard. This shed had no heating, and this was in the middle of winter, had no electricity, had no toileting facilities, he had no food. And this is a situation where I told you we're going to talk about Alzheimer's and dementia more. I know, and I want to commend you for having one of the only day centers in Utah for this population. I think that's really, really important. And again, I want to say thank you to you, but we need to think about this more globally in the sense of what we're going to do into the future. And again, those of you who want to maybe get involved with the legislature and advocate on their behalf, or get in touch with healthcare providers, etc., we need to think about this because, for example, what happens for you? Let's say you and your mother has Alzheimer's, and you don't want to leave her home all day because you don't want her to be hurt, or you don't want to put her in danger, but you have to go to work. What do you do? And that's a really real situation for a lot of people. So again, we need to think about those situations with Alzheimer's. The next thing I want to talk about is self-neglect. And self-neglect usually manifests itself as a refusal or failure to provide for the well-being of the vulnerable adult. So, for example, we might have a lady who is in her late 80s, early 90s. She lives in the home that she's lived with her family for ever since she was married. But her husband died 10 years ago, so she's alone in the home. Her children are all married and grown with their families of their own. she used to cook for her family and they're not there anymore, so she doesn't cook and she becomes malnourished. Also, as people age, their thirst reflex diminishes, and she doesn't realize that she needs to drink fluids, so she becomes dehydrated, which can lead to all kinds of physical issues, mainly like urinary tract infections or kidney issues and so forth. She kind of loses the ability to take care of some of her daily needs with her home because she's not physically able to do a lot of those things anymore. And she certainly can't take care of the outside of her house. So this is a situation where we would try to involve, perhaps we would get her connected with Meals on Wheels. So she would have a meal coming in every day and has someone to check on her. We might try to talk to her neighbors or her family. Maybe her children don't know. Maybe we would talk to her church group to try to help provide some service for this woman and help her stay in her own home as long as possible. So type of self-neglect. Even though these aren't criminal, now caretaker neglect is criminal, but self-neglect is not. And even though this is not criminal, we want you to report it so that it gives us the opportunity to maybe make those connections and help this woman get some help in her community. Another case of self-neglect is when a person makes a conscious and voluntary decision to stay in the situation of neglect. And this is one of those cases. And it's really difficult for a lot of people because we sometimes don't have the same value system. And this man lived in his home with 200 rabbits. You can see on the left, this is a picture from his front door, the entrance to his home. The purple thing in the back is his TV. You can see his bathroom. Most of us would say we don't want to live in this situation. But again, we have different value systems. This man had full capacity. He knew the consequences of his actions, and he knew the situation that he was living in. A lot of people would want to take this man out of the situation. And this is where sometimes people get angry with Adult Protective Services. They think we should go in and immediately remove this guy. Well, understand that we don't have the legal authority to do that. If this man has capacity, mental capacity, and he decides to stay there, we can't make him leave, even though it might be in his best interest. So we're going to call in community people to try to help him. But again, if he wants to stay in that situation, he has the right to self-determination, and we have to let him. So it's really important that we understand that we need to be respectful of people when they make decisions that we don't agree with. The next thing I want to talk about is exploitation. So exploitation usually manifests in financial exploitation. So possible signs would be missing property or money. It could be people that are forced to sign over control of their finances. It could be people that have inadequate living circumstances. So they may not have heat or electricity because their utilities have been shut off, or they might not have money for food and clothes. Again, these are just some possible signs, and you're not going to go in and ask somebody for a financial disclosure. But when you're talking to your clients, you're definitely going to hear some things that have been happening in their lives. And I want you to pay special attention to things that they say with regard to money. Risk factors associated with financial exploitation are if a person recently lost a spouse or a loved one, and particularly if that spouse managed the money, or if they have memory or cognitive issues like dementia. Right now, during the pandemic, people are so isolated and they're feeling so lonely and depressed that they're particularly vulnerable to being either scammed or exploited in terms of money and those sorts of things. So something to think about if they depend on others for care. I think it's really important for us to understand that sometimes loved ones will use the excuse of, if you give me money, then I'll come over and care for you. Or if you don't do something, then I won't let you see your grandchildren. And it's important for us to understand that those kind of threats and those kinds of things aren't appropriate. So we need to talk about those. Again, you're not going to ask for a financial disclosure, but you're going to listen very carefully to things that they say. Understand that financial exploitation doesn't only have monetary effects. It decreases that vulnerable adults' access to adequate health care and may even decrease their ability to get services such as the ones that Aspen provides. It may be that they can't, because this money has been taken, they can't afford their medications. I had someone report to me a couple of weeks ago that they had a situation where the sister was taking money from mom, and not only did mom not have money for the things that she needed, she didn't have money for her prescriptions at the end of the month. She didn't have money for her high blood pressure medication. She didn't have money for her heart medication. And the sister was also stealing pills, which is exploitation. So again, think about those things and think about how it might affect your clients. In Utah, this is a hard thing to really kind of come to grips with. In Utah, Utah seniors lose $52 million a year to exploitation, $52 million. And the thing that's the most difficult, I think, for us to comprehend is that 72% of those exploiting seniors are family members. So our family should be the people that we trust the most, the people that we definitely don't have to worry about stealing our money. And unfortunately, that's not the truth. Utah seniors lose $52 million, and most of it through family members. So again, we need to think about that, and we need to make sure that these folks are really protected. Financial exploitation is a criminal event and definitely can be prosecuted according to the law. The next thing we want to talk about is scams. So many of you have heard about scams, the grandma scam, the Social Security scam. The FBI recently put out a warning that romance scams are increasing in the state of Utah. And we are required to interview the perpetrator. And as such, we don't always know who the perpetrator is, or very seldom in these scams. So we're referring all of the scams reports to the Office of Consumer Protection. We still do all of the financial exploitation, but again, the scams that are coming from, other places. I just saw a report that I didn't know a lot of the scammers come from places that we just didn't even think about. Not only is it South Africa, it can be Israel, it can be Mexico, it can be lots of other places. So again, call the Utah Office of Consumer Protection. Understand that only 1 in 14 cases of abuse and neglect are reported, and 1 in 24 cases of exploitation. So understand that the ones that we saw the pictures of, those are the ones. And there's many, many, many more out there that we never hear about. And those people are sort of left to deal with these situations on their own, and they shouldn't have to do that. We should be able to help them. So again, reporting is really, really important. Understand that if you make an emergency referral, the investigation should be started within 24 hours. If not an emergency, it will be initiated within 3 working days. But if it's an emergency, you need to tell us that. And also, if it's somebody who has been physically abused and so forth, they probably need to go to the hospital or have some medical attention. So make sure that that's taken care of before you give us a call. Again, reporting requirements. This is the most important thing that you need to understand, that you are a mandatory reporter, and as such, you must report. You must report. You don't have a choice. You have to report under the law. You can call us, and we have our phone numbers, and I'm sure Melissa will follow up and give you those phone numbers as well. But probably the easiest way to do that would be to fill out a report on the web. We have a reporting form, and that's under daas.utah.gov. Again, it's the most important, or the easiest way for you to report. So again, I want to thank you for all you do. I want to let you know that you are a very important part of what we do as Adult Protective Services. We want to make sure that we're taking care of this very, very vulnerable population, and you are a really important part of that. So again, I want to thank you for all you do. And I'll turn it back over to Melissa.
Okay, thank you so much, Debbie, for that important information. We appreciate that.
Sure.
Okay. Well, we will be following up caregivers with the information on how to contact Debbie if you have any follow-up questions, as well as all of the website information and phone numbers to report if you come across anything. So thank you for taking the time to watch this in service today.
Great.